global liquidity is the number one force that drives the modern global economy. In this video, we're going to unpack everything that you need to know. Now, a lot of my framework for global liquidity is derived from two individuals. The first is Raoul Pal, who I imagine most of you, or many of you, will have be familiar with. For me, he is one of, if not the best mind when it comes to the macro. And then the second is a man named Michael Howell, who is considered as the king of global liquidity. If you haven't already, I strongly recommend that you look into Howell's work, subscribe to his Substack, and also read his book, Capital Wars. It's a very technical book, very dense book, but if you want to understand global liquidity at a very granular level, a very deep level, then that is the book for you. Okay, so let's get stuck in. What is global liquidity? Very simple. Global liquidity is defined as the amount of money, both cash and credit, that is available to flow through financial markets. So in other words, how much capital is free to be used in the economy? Okay, again, very simple. So what are the main drivers? There are three key drivers for global liquidity. The first is the size of central bank balance sheets, specifically the Federal Reserve and the People's Bank of China, the PBOC. The second is the size of commercial bank balance sheets. And the third is the size of collateral held by banks that can be easily converted into cash through the repo market. So why does global liquidity matter? It matters because it directly influences asset prices. So for example, global liquidity has a 97% correlation with the NASDAQ, as illustrated in this image by GMI, and an 85% correlation with Bitcoin, also illustrated in this image, again from GMI. So essentially, global liquidity is a leading indicator. In fact, it's the leading indicator. Specifically, global liquidity leads asset prices by roughly between 3 to 9 months, which is illustrated in this brilliant chart by Cross-Border Capital that shows the correlation between global liquidity and Bitcoin with a 13-week lag. Okay, let's talk about the global liquidity cycle. So just like everything else, global liquidity moves in cycles which tend to span between 4 to 6 years, as illustrated again in this chart by Cross-Border Capital. Now, the global liquidity cycle works through alternating phases of liquidity expansion, which is when liquidity increases, and liquidity contraction, which is when liquidity decreases. When liquidity increases, there's more capital available for investment, which drives asset prices up. When liquidity decreases, there's less capital available for investment, which drives asset prices down. Now, here's a table I created that compares global liquidity to the season. So as you can see, spring is akin to early cycle when liquidity levels are increasing, as are asset prices. Summer is akin to mid-cycle when liquidity levels are peaking or at their highest, as are asset prices. Autumn is late cycle when liquidity levels are falling, as are asset prices. Winter is end cycle, liquidity levels are at their lowest, and asset prices are also at their lowest. Now let's talk sensitivity. So different assets possess different degrees of sensitivity to changes in global liquidity. So for example, for every 10% move, either up or down in global liquidity, the S&P 500 moves by roughly 13%, commodities tend to move by roughly 11%, gold tends to move by roughly 15%, and Bitcoin tends to move by roughly 50%. Okay, last but not least, how does global liquidity affect financial stability? History shows that financial stability requires a near constant ratio between the total stock of debt and the total pool of liquidity of around 2.5 to 1. So in other words, every $100 of global debt requires roughly $40 of liquidity to refinance it. When we use the word refinance, what we're actually referring to is the process of replacing old debts with new debts. And the purpose usually for that is to either extend the repayment period, reduce interest costs, or manage financial obligations. Now, and this is important, too much debt relative to liquidity leads to financial crises because debts mature and cannot be rolled over. Too much liquidity relative to debt leads to financial bubbles because of monetary inflation. So in other words, there's a Goldilocks zone where if debt and liquidity are in balance, then the economy can grow in a sustainable way without any financial crises or financial bubbles. And this dynamic is illustrated in another brilliant chart by Cross-Border Capital, as you can see here. So as you can see, in 2008, we had the US housing bubble, which was a consequence of too much liquidity. And then following that, we had the Eurozone banking crisis, which was a consequence of too much debt. And then as you can see, we had the cryptocurrency boom in 2020, and that was also a consequence of too much liquidity. Okay, so that's everything I wanted to get through. Hopefully now you have a better understanding of what global liquidity is. It goes without saying, this is just a framework. It's not infallible, but at least for me, in all of my research, if there's one metric that has the most predictive power, it is global liquidity. Now, I have put together a written piece that breaks down all of the key points that we have covered in this video. So if you're watching on YouTube, I'll leave a link to that article in the notes. If you're watching on X, I'll leave a link in the comments. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to DM me on X. And until next time, remember, the best is yet to come.